decided to begin EWTN's programming on that first evening EWTN went on the air by broadcasting a documentary on the Shroud of Turin. Back in the late 1970s, I was an engineering student in Chicago, and I was reading a magazine about new technologies, which had an article about a group of American scientists who had been permitted by the Vatican to examine the Shroud of Turin using the latest technology. I was fascinated with the article and really have been ever since. Tonight we are happy to welcome to EWTN one of the men among that original group of scientists and researchers, Mr. Barrie Schwortz. Welcome, Barrie.
Thank you, Charlie.
Now, Barrie, where did the idea come from to form a team that would go and research the Shroud of Turin image?
Well, several scientists at Los Alamos National Laboratories and their sister laboratory, Sandia Labs, had a device called a VP8 image analyzer, and it basically allowed you to put a photograph into it using just a black and white video camera. And that then allowed you to extract the information and raise and lower it. And normally when you put a photograph or an artwork into the VP8, you get a rather distorted, jumbled kind of result. Mm-hmm. When they put a photograph of the Shroud of Turin into the VP8, they got the natural relief of a human form, which shouldn't be possible.
Right.
And it indicated immediately to them that there was something unique about the image on the Shroud, something that was not typical of any other images that any of us were familiar with, and there were a bunch of imaging scientists involved in the group. So that became effectively the catalyst that led these scientists to say, look, let's put together a team of experts in various appropriate disciplines, and let's see if we can get permission and go to Turin and examine the Shroud to determine and answer a single question: how was the image formed? Ironically, after 5 days and nights of examination, 2 years of planning before we went, and 3 years of producing the data and publishing it afterwards, the result was that we could not answer that question. We could tell you what it's not. It's not a photograph, it's not a painting, it's not a rubbing, and it's not a scorch, but we know of no mechanism today that can create an image with those same chemical and physical properties.
So this was technology that was being used by like the Voyager exploration. Well, so they were taking images out in space and they were translating those into 3D images, and they discovered that this had a 3D property too.
Exactly. There's depth information, or like topographical information, is encoded into the image. And we had members on the team not just from Los Alamos and Sandia Labs, but the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, the Air Force Academy, and of course NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And interestingly enough, my hero on the team, Don Lynn, was the imaging project manager in charge of all imaging on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo projects, among others. So I was thrilled to be on the team with someone of that. You know, I'm a photographer, a professional photographer, and a NASA imaging scientist is about as good as it gets.
Some very prestigious people in their own fields were going to examine this shroud.
Yeah, and I was very honored to have been asked to be a participant.
And how did that happen? How did that come about that you were invited?
I had done a project as a consultant to Los Alamos National Laboratories, worked with another man named Don DeVan, and we finished the project. It was 7 months long, and obviously it had something to do with atomic bombs. We finished that project, and I went back to my normal routine. And a few weeks later, Don DeVan called me again, and he said, "Gee, Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I kind of laughed, and I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And Don laughed, and he said, "So am I, remember?" And I went, "Oh, yeah." So Don asked me to be on the team, and immediately I said no, because I felt uncomfortable with the thought of being involved with something I perceived to be a Christian object or relic, and I just wasn't very comfortable. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, very much like Fiddler on the Roof.
Right.
Both my parents born in Poland, the grandparents lived with us. It was really like that. So I was very uncomfortable, but the image properties caught my attention. And if I can just add at that moment, the man I mentioned from NASA, Don Lynn, I remember saying to Don one day after he had joined the team, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing involved with the Shroud?" And he looked at me, and he was Catholic, and he said, Barrie, perhaps you've forgotten that the man in question's a Jew. And I said, no, Don, that's about the only thing I know about Jesus. But I knew he was Jewish. And he said, oh, so you don't believe that God would want one of his chosen people on our team? And then I laughed. And I said, no, I didn't think that. Don gave me the best advice. Perhaps I've been giving him all of my life. He said, Barrie, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know. Those words were the words that kept me on the team. Yeah. And of course, I've never regretted it. And I'm grateful that I was able to, before Don passed, to thank him for saying those words to me. And truthfully, in retrospect, I really believe that was God speaking to me through his voice.
Yeah. And you really did not expect that it was something authentic, that you would very quickly discover that it had been painted, that it was a forgery.
I unfortunately said publicly, give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint and the brushstrokes, and we'll go home. It's 35 years later, I'm still here.
Still here.
And of course, I would say within the first 10 or 15 minutes of the shroud being placed before us, you know, we photographers always carry high-power magnifying glasses in our pockets. I immediately started looking for paint and brushstrokes, and guess what? There is absolutely none on that cloth, other than a few microscopic particles of paint that came from copies of the shroud that were painted by artists through the centuries and then permitted to be laid onto the cloth to sanctify.
Oh, I see.
And so a few paint particles would come off, but in the images, in the area of the image, there's absolutely no more of those microscopic particles than there is in the non-image area. That is not what forms the image on the shroud.
What was some of the equipment that you brought with you to examine the shroud? I know you said you were very careful not to damage the shroud in any way.
Every test that we designed, and we spent 17 months before we left planning and designing our exam, every test was designed first to be non-destructive. We didn't want to cause any harm to the cloth. So rather than, so to find a way to fasten it so that we could raise it up and look at it, they designed and fabricated a steel table so we could fasten the shroud to the table with magnets, thus causing no harm. Ironically, it had been on public display, and when they took it off public display and brought it to us, it had been thumbtacked onto a piece of wood. And here they are taking out the thumbtacks, and I'm looking at it and thinking all the trouble we went through to preserve it, and they had already crucified the shroud.
Oh, boy. So when you arrived there, was the church involved in the research? Were they overseeing it and telling you what to do, or dictating that sort of thing?
At the beginning, you have to remember, first of all, the owner of the shroud until 1985 was King Umberto, the last Duke of Savoy of the royal monarchy of Italy. He was in exile in Portugal, but his family, the Savoy family, owned the shroud for about 600 years. So our primary permission came from King Umberto. He and his family had always had the church be the custodians, the caretakers of it. And so we needed, of course, their permission as well. So we developed and created a 70-page test plan detailing every aspect of every experiment, which they saw and ultimately approved.
But as far as carrying out the research, was the church involved in telling you you can do this or you can't do that?
Actually, I was shocked at how they distanced themselves away from us. The king had an emissary there. There were two priests there. Monsignor Catino, who was the keeper of the shroud, had several of the keys of the 3 keys to the reliquary. Monsignor Carmelo, who was the pastor of the cathedral, and they sat and observed. They absolutely had no bearing on anything we did, and they intentionally stayed back so that it would not appear that they were trying to influence the science, and I promise you they had absolutely no impact on what we did other than to observe.
They were just observing, so it was really faith and science working together to come to the truth.
And of course, you and I discussed this earlier, but you know, my definition, I always hear this, that there's this war between science and faith, and I thought about it long and hard, and I came to realize that science is simply man's attempt to understand God's creation. So why should they be opposed to each other?
That they're both leading us toward the truth, right? So we're not afraid of science.
That's right.
We want to know the truth scientifically, and also the faith is leading us to God.
I agree, and I think that for me, the most important part of all this that has led me to do what we're going to talk about here in lecturing around the world and educating people to the shroud, was that I was very frustrated. When we came back and I saw the media reports, I realized that my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting the truth about the Shroud of Turin. It was very frustrating and irritating to me because I was there, I was a witness to the event, I was a participant, and it was very frustrating to see how things were spun in the press that turned the kind of the interest in the Shroud away from the cloth and sort of speculating that, oh, we were a bunch of religious fanatics and the science was not valid and all this. And frankly, I don't think that any group of scientists in the world could have done something better than what we did in 1978. But of course, by today's standards, we're very limited by the technology of the time. What we had was the best that was available to us in 1978.
What would you say were some of the findings that surprised you?
Well, I'm not certain that I was too surprised by much, but there were a few things about the Shroud that were hard for me to grasp. And the first one was something we noted almost immediately. I was with Vernon Miller, who was our chief scientific photographer, a dear friend of mine, passed away. And Vernon and I looked at the Shroud. We stood next to each other, and we saw that the blood was still reddish or crimson in color. Vern had a lot of experience in forensic work, and he and I both knew that old blood is supposed to turn brown or red, or black rather, not red, and not stay red. And that was kind of a deal breaker. Both Vern and I just kind of looked at it and went, nah, that's when I thought maybe that's paint. But it turns out that the blood chemist on our team, Dr. Alan Adler, another Jewish member of our team and a world-renowned blood chemist, did the analysis and proved, and you'll find me using that word only occasionally, but we proved that the blood is not paint or pigment, but actual human blood. It had hemoglobin and porphyrins and other components of blood. And also, Dr. Adler found a very high content of bilirubin. And that's commonly the case when someone is tortured over a period of time, not given water, body goes into shock, the liver starts producing bilirubin and pumping it into the bloodstream, and Adler had found a very high content of bilirubin in the blood. So it's blood.
And if that's present in the blood, then the blood remains red.
Yes, bilirubin is it's a hemolytic agent. It breaks down the red blood cell walls. And once that happens, the blood stays red forever. But I didn't find that out until 17 years later.
Now, you obviously believe in the authenticity of the Shroud. What are some of the things that you concluded in examining the Shroud that have led you to believe, as well as what you just mentioned, but other things that led?
Well, as soon as I had the opportunity to look at it closely, I realized my stupid statement about seeing the blood, seeing the brush marks and going home was that was over with. There are no brush strokes. There is no paint or pigment, and it didn't take me very long to put that idea aside. But that didn't explain some of these unique properties, the encoding of depth or spatial information or topographical information. That's, if you really look at it from a scientific point of view, the only way that can happen is if there's some interaction between the cloth and the body it covers. So that really forces you to accept that there had to be a body with the cloth covering it. And so that was one of the important things. But I'll tell you, people often ask me what was it that brought me over the edge? Well, 17 years later, it was finding out that the bilirubin caused the blood to remain red, but I didn't know that for a long time. I was pretty much convinced that the Shroud was most likely authentic, but I wasn't completely convinced. And of course, until I found out about the bilirubin. But there were so many things that when people ask me what was it that convinced me, I only can answer all of the above. What people don't understand is there's such a vast amount of information about this cloth now that's been gathered, and it's almost overwhelming. And ironically, you think you're going to go and you're going to examine this cloth and you're going to answer the questions. And instead, we came back with 1,000 new questions and very few answers. But we did eliminate painting and scorching and these or photographic means. So all of those were eliminated, but that didn't really bring us any closer to an answer. As I said earlier, the evidence basically shows us that we don't know a mechanism that can make an image with these chemical and physical properties.
And we know where this shroud was from like the 1350s or so. We can definitively say where it was.
Correct. The chain of custody, the chain of its history, starts in the mid-1300s with an unbroken chain of custody until today. Mm-hmm. The problem, and of course this is what gives the skeptics all the ammunition, is there are breaks in the history of the shroud. And what people often forget is this is a Jewish burial cloth with blood on it. Mm-hmm. Jewish law says it must remain in the tomb. So how did this burial cloth of a Jewish man, how did it escape the tomb? Why was it not buried with the body? And that's a good question, mm-hmm. because Jewish law says it can't leave the tomb. So I have to share with you what my 90-year-old mother said. Jewish mother, born in Poland, not well educated, high school, immigrated to America as a child. She heard one of my lectures about 8 years ago, and afterward she was very quiet. And when a Jewish mother's quiet, be afraid. I was very nervous. And so I turned to her mother, and I said, "Mother, what do you think?" And she turned to me in that typical kind of condescending Jewish mother attitude, and she said, "Barrie, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it didn't belong to Jesus. If it belonged to anyone else, nobody would care."
Right.
And I laughed. I thought, what a clever response. The more I realized and thought about it, I realized this was a very profound observation. This is a burial shroud.
Yeah.
And why did they keep it? Why was it kept? Now, people often ask me why the Gospels don't mention it. Well, Jewish law says it has to be in the tomb, and it also bears an image, which is also forbidden by Jewish law. So the disciples could not come running out of the tomb saying, "Look what we found." It would have been destroyed, and they might have been the next ones to be punished. So I think that it makes sense that it was hidden away and kept secret for a very long time. So these breaks in its history provides all the ammunition in the world for the skeptics to deny it, but there are many signs of it, of cloths bearing the image of Jesus, mentioned throughout history, starting in about the 4th or 5th century, again in the 9th century, in the 10th century. So throughout history, there are references to a cloth like the shroud, but of course it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin until it arrived in Turin in 1578.
And everything is anatomically correct, right? Even before they knew some of the medical properties of blood, whether it's coming from veins or from arteries.
Correct.
That it's anatomically correct on the shroud.
Beyond anatomically correct, since we are living in a kind of a CSI environment now, everybody knows all the buzzwords. It is absolutely forensically accurate, and the real experts who have studied it that are forensic scientists say that it is absolutely perfect, that it is like studying a real crime scene. And Dr. Zugaby, whose book you're familiar with, may rest in peace, just passed away recently. Yes. He studied it. He was the medical examiner of Rockland County, New York. He studied it and studied crucifixion for over 50 years and the effects of crucifixion on the body. And he said the only way this cloth got the blood stains and things that it shows was by coming in contact with the body. There's no other way. No artist could have done that. And interestingly enough, the blood stains apparently were on the cloth before the image formed. So if a forger was going to make this, he would first put forensically accurate blood stains onto a blank sheet and then paint a body around it without paint.
Right.
Well, I don't think that's very possible.
That we can say it's very impossible for anyone to have produced this, right? From the human hand.
Think
How could
about
you do it?
this. Father, we now live in probably the most image-oriented age in our history.
Yes.
Everyone has a camera in their hand, a computer on their lap. We do imaging. 2-year-old kids are playing with images on computers now. And yet, with all that technology and capability, no one has been able to even come close to duplicating the chemical and physical properties on the shroud.
Well, let's talk about the carbon-14 dating.